right. Welcome to the show. My name is Brett, and for at least the next hour, we're going to be talking about some new beta features. And they just happened today. So I thought, let's change the whole show around and completely do something different than what we thought about doing. So while you're here, thanks for showing up on time. I was a minute or two late. Um, let's talk about what's going on. Like, this channel, in case you're new, some of you are not new and you've been around quite some time. I've been doing this for 2 years, almost every Thursday, talking about container stuff and more broadly, containers in the world of DevOps. So that means, how do we automate things? How do we make things consistent and immutable and reliable? And we talk about Docker and Kubernetes and all the tools. But really, at the end of the day, we're just trying to get code from a machine that a developer made it on onto a production server and all the things in between. So that's a lot. And so if you're not subscribed to this channel, you do the right thing and you click the subscribe. And if you click that bell, then you get a little notification on your phone when I go live, which is how everybody shows up on time because I'm random with my start schedule. It might be 2 minutes early, it might be 5 minutes late, but you get a nice little notification on your phone from YouTube. And if you're not a Patreon follower or member, you can also jump on my Patreon page. So if you click down in the description, basically, if you want to support this show, if you want to support the podcast that comes out of it, I'm working on another episode released today. The podcast is an edited version of this show, especially when I have guests and we have a really good conversation around some topic that will turn into an audio-only podcast. And so you can get all that, plus all the information about the newsletter, my courses that you can buy, all the other stuff over here up at brettfisher.com. So thank you so much to my Patreon members. I so appreciate your patronage. And they're coming up soon. We do a monthly DevOps live chat in Zoom. Essentially this, but you get to hang out in audio and video too. So that's all my Patreon members on the High Fivers Club. So you can go to my Patreon page and find out about that. That's a member benefit for those people. And thank you for all of those that do. Every few days I get a new patron, and I'm always so excited to welcome you to the group and to see how we can grow this community around container DevOps and specifically around container tools like Docker, which is what we're going to be talking about all day today. All right, so we have a bunch of questions already in chat, and before we get to those, let's just break the news. Just a few hours ago, Docker and AWS sort of co-announced a new beta integration for the Docker command line. This is specifically in Docker Desktop. Technically, you could probably get it to work without Docker Desktop, but it's going to be bundled in Docker Desktop. So it's kind of really meant as a developer tool for being on your machine locally. And let's look at that announcement. All right, so the Docker one was called From Docker Straight to AWS, and I'll put this in chat. And then the companion URL from AWS with more information on the technicals is over on the AWS website. Now, what's happening right now is they're actually, over at AWS, they're having a container conference today. So if you had any free time today, you want to go check out the container conference, which is a bunch of, I think, pre-recorded sessions, but they're live on Twitch. So you can go check that out on twitch.tv/AWS. Yeah, and then later today, Docker and AWS, I think it's going to be, let's see, 1, 2, 3, I think around 6 hours. Basically, if you read the Docker blog post, in about 6 hours, Docker and AWS are going to have a session on that Twitch AWS Cloud Conference, or Container Conference, rather. Yeah, right here, 3:45 Pacific. So if you have the time, go check that out. That'll basically give you all the details. Now, I'm coming into this pretty new, just like you. As Docker captains, we got a few days early warning, but I didn't get a chance to play with the beta. So that's what we're going to do today. Now, if you have been a regular on this show, watching, and you noticed a couple of weeks ago, I talked about Docker's recent announcement about Azure's ACI integration, which they announced at DockerCon in May. All right, so this one is slightly different than that one. It's not simply just taking the same features and putting them on a different cloud. So this is what's happening when Docker is using the features of the platform, right? So each one of these integrations is going to feel different because the cloud that they're running it on is different. The idea here isn't that Docker is simply doing the same thing on each cloud. So they're going to take specific integrations from each cloud and build that against the Docker command line. So if you go back a couple of weeks, that was actually 2 weeks ago today, and you look in this channel on YouTube, in case you're watching on Periscope, this is not on Periscope. 2 weeks ago in YouTube, I demoed and struggled through some basics around how to use Docker run and then the new Docker compose command, not Docker-compose, but Docker space compose, how to use the two of those to deploy one or more containers on Azure's ACI. And we saw how easy it was to use. We saw some practical limitations, like you can't map ports, you can't have more than one port in a compose file, and other various limitations that are more about Azure's API limitations and how they run containers and stuff like that. It was more about that than it was necessarily Docker. The cool thing is that all of this stuff's happening on the roadmap in open source. So if you care about either the Azure or the AWS integration, you can get involved. The way to do that, by the way, is over on the Docker roadmap. So let's just check that out real quick. Docker/roadmap. So you can see if you go under the roadmap and then into projects, you'll see just one project. And this is basically the future of all Docker products. So Docker today is mainly Docker Hub, Docker Desktop, and the Docker Engine, right? Docker Desktop including things like Docker Compose, and now these new integrations. So all of the open future features, now of course we don't know about little surprises they throw us like this new AWS ECS integration, but you can find out about a lot of the other ones here. And then if you go up a notch to the Docker organization, into the repositories, you'll see new ones showing up whenever they announce these things. So for example, we're going to talk about the ECS plugin today, which is its own repo. We can actually read a bunch of the information here on the README about how it works, actually how it's integrated with Docker, what it's doing in the background. We're going to get into all that. And then from weeks past, we have like the ACI integration, which was the beta that was added in. Well, we saw the demo in May at DockerCon, and then we got to play with it starting a couple of weeks ago. And they keep releasing these things on a Thursday, which is the day I go live, so it's very convenient. But back on Docker's page, they have a demo here that you can watch. It's a pretty short one. And then we can just dive into the README if you want to really get a sense for what is going on there. So before we get into a demo of this and how it's maybe different than the Azure one and how this works, let me jump into chat because you all are asking some questions. All right, so Biker, let's see. Biker was asking earlier about does Swarm automatically try to spread replicas across as many nodes as available, given any constraints? So by default, Swarm and Kubernetes are both designed to do a spread algorithm. So based on the requirements that you give the service, in the case of Kubernetes, you're not asking about Kubernetes, but in the case of Kubernetes, it would be like a deployment. Based on those requirements and the constraints and stuff, it will spread them out. The reason that it may not spread out is because, to me, the biggest number one reason, if you have a really simple service, is that either that node's agent is not reachable. Basically, the Docker daemon is not able to be contacted. So if you do a Docker node ls, you will see a list of your nodes, and you want to make sure those are healthy. And then the next thing would be if you're using reservations. Swarm reservations are something that will prevent a container from running on a node if Docker sees they're already having too many reservations, so it can't. For example, it doesn't have enough memory left on that node to reserve for the container you're running. And by the way, those reservations are a simple calculation. They are not a real-time monitoring solution. They are simply saying, hey, this server says it has 8 gig. You've asked for this container to have 4 gig of memory. There is 4 gig of memory left in my simple math calculation. Because remember, Swarm doesn't do long-term monitoring or any sort of metrics tracking of all the nodes like you have with the optional Kubernetes add-on. For Docker, that would be some third-party tool like Prometheus or something. So it has to do a very simple calculation based on the raw hardware. It can't determine in real time if there's utilization or if there's capacity. It simply says, if this container service was asked to reserve each replica 4 gig, then I can only run 2 of them on an 8 gig server. It's pretty simple like that. Is there a way to preclude it from putting more than 1 on any given node, not global, which is 1 on every node? To do those reservations, that's how you would prevent that. But that's a resource constraint. There's no real way, and this is actually, if you go look into SwarmKit bugs or in GitHub under SwarmKit, you will find a request for people to have manual reservations. And now that I'm saying this, I feel like there was an addition. There was an addition to SwarmKit that maybe made it possible for you to do this. I'm realizing that maybe in the last 6 months or in the last 8 months or so, Docker may have added a little feature. So, Biker, basically the question is maybe there might be something new about it. The first thing I would do is go look in the SwarmKit repo and in the Moby repos to see if there's anything about Swarm and either something in global that allows for multiples per node, or in the constraints for you to limit 1 per node. I'm trying to remember. Basically, it's been a request for a long time. Say you have a database replica, right? You never want those 2 replicas to be on the same node. You always want them to be on separate nodes. And if they're separate services, for example, then Docker Swarm doesn't know how to keep them on separate nodes. And so there was, we could actually do this back in the old school classic Swarm, but we haven't been able to do that in SwarmKit since the beginning. But I feel like there's been something that's happened in the last year. Now, whether it's in a release of Docker, I don't know. It might have been patched in the main branch, in the master branch, and not put into a Docker release yet. But ping me on Twitter, ping me somewhere else, Biker, and I will find out your answer in terms of the latest on what that is. All right. Does this Docker AWS beta allow us to deploy in Swarm mode? No, this Docker AWS beta is specifically for deploying to ECS. So this is the same thing as with the Docker integration with Azure. These integrations are not about deploying Docker containers on a Docker engine directly on some server in the cloud. That's not what this is about, because we could already do that. We could just deploy Docker. We could do an apt-get install docker-io or whatever. We could do all that before. What this is doing is specifically taking the container-rich features of a cloud vendor and then adding them as an integration into the Docker CLI to use the specific cloud vendor's functionality. This isn't about taking Docker's built-in functionality like Docker Swarm and making it work in a specific cloud, because we've kind of already had that. We didn't need Docker to basically. Docker's getting out of the game of installing Docker for you. Like Docker Machine, that is a deprecated product. It still works today, but Docker is getting out of the machine deployment business. They are focused more on developer tooling and talking to clouds and using cloud integrations natively for each specific cloud. All right, hope that helps. That it's a subtle difference, but I think it's the right way to go, because just like in the real world and consulting and working with companies, everyone's trying to get out of the machine management business, right? As the cloud promised us cheap and easy machines, the sort of the cloud 2.0 is, let's hide the infrastructure and give you API abstractions to deploy your apps. Heroku did that a decade ago. Everyone else has had their own ideas about how to do that. The most modern ideas we might be getting towards is a more Kubernetes-centric standard like Fargate, like maybe, or something different like Google Cloud Run, or just doing Heroku, which has done this stuff for quite some time. So what Docker is trying to do is to give you the Docker tooling in the command line to deploy, and it may be on a Docker instance engine, rather, maybe on a Docker engine eventually, but it's using the cloud APIs to use on, like in the case of AWS, we're using ECS, not a Docker engine that we talk to directly. We're talking to the ECS API, which is spinning up servers in the background, creating tasks, and it may ultimately have Docker running underneath, but we're not interacting directly with that Docker engine. That would be something that we would do with like the Docker host environment variable or something like that. All right. That's a great question, actually. Let's see what else. All right. I assume that I can't have two different from lines in a Docker file, say Nginx and PHP. I would need to specify the Nginx image in the from line and the PHP separately. All right. So, Paul, your question has actually two answers. The first answer is yes, technically you can have two froms now that we have multi-stage images. So you'll want to look up multi-stage images. However, in your case, what you're asking about really is that you have a PHP app that needs to have Nginx as the web server. And in that solution, you have two ways to do it. You can deploy them as separate containers, and if you're in Kubernetes, this is an excellent way to use two containers in a single pod. So you would deploy an Nginx container and a PHP container in the same pod, and they could use localhost or a file socket to mount, and that's how Nginx and PHP would talk to each other. Or you could create one huge image with both. That's what I used to do. And that's kind of what I still do when I'm using Swarm, is I create one giant image. I have a repo for that, but I'll warn you, it's quite outdated at this point. And let's see if I can just Google and if I can Bing Google that. Yeah, it's not funny. Oh, wait, there we go. So I'll put this in chat. So that's a PHP example of one large Docker file. And now you can't just build it. It doesn't actually build correctly. You have to kind of look at it for the patterns of how it works. Anyway, that's the answer to Paul's question. All right. Oh, there you go, Biker. I'm catching up in chat. Yeah, the new switch, replicas max per node switch. Yeah, so that's a new one. Good finding that. I'm so glad I didn't have to go do that. Because I wasn't sure exactly what it was called. So it's a switch on creating a service, and you can prevent that exact behavior. Very cool. I have yet to use it in the real world because I tend to try to avoid running databases or anything that cares about running multiple ones on the servers. The thing with Swarm is in production, besides just all the health checks and everything else, you're going to want to use the resource reservations. And when you start using reservations, you learn you have to use them on every single service. Otherwise, they don't really work. Because if you deploy an app without any reservations, Docker won't count that against the total. It will just think it doesn't need any resources, and it'll deploy it anywhere. And it may run a server that doesn't have resources, or it may cause a server that you've reserved resources on to not have enough. So if you're going to use those resource reservations to help with this problem as well, then make sure you use it on everything. I have no idea how you open links in chat from mobile. Base image. You can always watch this, by the way, later. This video will be back up on YouTube later. Just go to brett.live. Brett.live. That's where you can get those videos on YouTube. All right. Aside from retrying again, how do you handle update out of sequence errors when deploying several stacks at once? That's exactly what I would do. I would retry again. If you're doing this through automation, you might have to do some pauses in your automation just to simply allow things to settle. This is the same problem we have in Kubernetes. If you have a really large manifest file and it starts creating resources that have dependencies on other resources, it will error out there as well. So Swarm is no different. You just kind of have to retry. And if you have automation, you have to build into the automation the logic to look for that and then to retry. If the AWS beta reduces the work of creating service, task, and container definitions for ECS, I am all in. Yeah, so let's talk about that. If you go look at, here's a little demo that they're doing inside. What's happening in the background with the ECS plugin, and this is using ECS. Now that's an orchestrator, right? So what we're talking about with this new feature, which you can now get on the website. By the way, you can go to Docker's website. Let's see. You just go to the Docker blog page. They give you a way to get it. It's also, I believe, in the latest version of Edge. So if you're running Docker Desktop Edge, like I am, which is kind of like beta, it's a stable beta. I've really rarely, I don't even remember the last time I had problems with it. I think it's been years. But their beta release, that's kind of new features kind of thing. That's the Docker Desktop Edge release down here. And once you get that, then you'll have a couple of new commands, including the Docker ACI one and now the Docker ECS one. Now, this ECS one is different because we're deploying to an AWS orchestrator, not simply just running a single container. So this isn't a Docker run command like we saw with the ACI one. At least I don't think it is. We can try. We can try to break it. But this uses your AWS credentials to deploy to an ECS cluster. And in the background, when you're using this, you're using a compose file. So you'll notice in this little pop-up, oh, it made it smaller. Let's see if I can make it bigger. All right. You'll see in this little demo, Docker ECS, we do the setup, create a cluster, pick a region, you can optionally enter credentials. Now we're using the Docker context command, just like we did the other week. We're changing the context to our new ECS context. So it's pointing, that new Docker context is pointing to this new ECS cluster, and then we do a Docker ECS compose up. And in this case, it's a little bit different command. We saw previously, a couple of weeks ago, with Docker compose up using the ACI context. But in this case, it's a slightly different command. I'm going to tell you why in a minute. All right, so you'll notice there, that's a whole list of AWS resources it was creating. All right. And then we can do a PS command to get status, and that's the demo. So let's go over to the repo. So what's happening in the background here is Docker is transforming your Docker compose file into CloudFormation for you using templating, basically, that they have created, and then creating the CloudFormation objects so that you have this ECS cluster and allowing you to deploy from the Docker command line. The goal here, the goal with Docker's solution is to solve the problem of someone having an app and simply wanting to deploy it to ECS. But the problem is they have their images, they know the Docker command line, and now to simply deploy it to ECS, which the nice thing about ECS is it's a solution that, if the container crashes, it will spin it up. It can do rolling updates of apps so that you don't have outages and downtime during the app updates. So it's better than a single Docker engine. Obviously, it's not the full-featured compose or Kubernetes solution, right? It's not the Kubernetes, but it is a very Swarm-esque kind of solution, and it works for a lot of people. I have multiple customers and friends that are all still on ECS. They haven't jumped ship to Kubernetes because they just don't see really any value because ECS works for them. So in this case, the ideal use case is someone who just wants to deploy in a reliable way on AWS without having to learn yet another tool. So this avoids the necessity to learn the AWS CLI tool or to completely rewrite from scratch a bunch of CloudFormation. Yeah, so this can keep you in the Docker tooling, and this is just the start. So obviously, to start with, this is going to have limited features. I'm expecting some rough edges, some things that we wish we could support, like volumes, which it currently doesn't support. So this is going to be, this is not going to be for your static, your persistent data. This is only going to be for your, web apps, your worker apps, your basically your apps that you can destroy and they won't matter, right? It won't lose data on the back end. I mean, you should be using RDS in most cases anyway. So this is a great first beta, at least. It also can't do port translations. So similar to the Azure problem of I can't have port 3000 in my container show up as port 80, but we might be able to find other ways around that. We might be able to put up a AWS load balancer, maybe do that with port translation there. It will, I think, allow us to deploy multiple ports. We just can't translate. So we'll see that in a minute. I'm going to play around with it. So yeah, they explain here that it goes through these steps of validating the YAML, then converting it into a CloudFormation template, and then applying it to the AWS API. All right. Let's go back to the questions here. VMware vSphere 7. I have never used it, so sorry, I'm not going to have any opinions. I haven't ran true VMware infrastructure in a decade. Haven't had to deal with it. So I leave that up to smarter people. Do they or will they have a similar Kubernetes service like Azure? I'm not sure what you're asking. We're not talking about Kubernetes today. This has nothing to do with Kubernetes. We're simply deploying from the Docker command line to a cloud's sort of built-in non-Kubernetes way. I mean, with Kubernetes, the cloud tools are largely solving that problem, right? If you want to go Kubernetes, you're going to be creating Kubernetes YAML manifests, and you're going to be spinning up a cloud-specific container, Kubernetes solution, and then using manifest to deploy with kubectl apply. In this case, what Docker is trying to do is try to keep you inside the Docker tooling, not to deploy to Kubernetes, because there's already that tooling, but to allow you to do something like a compose file in the cloud with the cloud vendor's preferred tooling, right? This is not simply converting a compose file to Kubernetes and then applying it to a Kubernetes cluster. That actually already exists, and it's called Compose on Kubernetes. So if you're interested in that, go Google Compose on Kubernetes, which is a specific open source tool from Docker that does that. All right. Does Docker Compose ECS plugin support replicating containers across geolocations like how Kubernetes does? I don't know. I'm going to guess on the first beta that was not a requested feature. Can demo it. Yeah, so I'm not going to demo Swarm today. Today we're going to be focused on the Docker ECS plugin. Docker deployments on SSH in Windows 10? I'm not sure I understand what that question is. Maybe ask it a different way. Are you simply asking how to use the Docker command line on your machine to deploy to a remote Docker server using SSH? Because that would just be setting the Docker host environment variable or changing your context. We've talked about context a lot on this show, and I feel like Archimedes, you've been around and you might have seen that. So maybe ask the question a different way. I'm not sure if I'm understanding it correctly. Use AWS CMD for your deploys. Yeah. So the point here, Scott, is that you won't have to use that unless you're answering a different question. The goal here is that for a lot of people that don't know the AWS CLI, they simply want to deploy a compose file into the cloud. And if Docker can get them, basically, if Docker can allow you to avoid needing the AWS CLI to simply deploy your images, then that's kind of what Docker and AWS are building together. And by the way, this isn't Docker building this for AWS. This is the Docker and AWS's teams working together, because today you can already use compose files with the AWS CLI. So, this is maybe an easier way to do it for people that know Docker but don't know AWS yet. I'm sure eventually everyone needs to know the AWS CLIs, but Docker is always about making tooling that's more automated and easier without you having to know a bunch of different tools to simply deploy a small solution. Obviously, when we all get really complex and we have large solutions and large enterprises, everything gets harder. You get a lot more tooling. But when one developer wants to deploy one app into the cloud with a container and it's hard, then it's, I've always felt like we weren't really doing our job as tool makers. It should be easier for a small team with a small product than it is for an enterprise. And sometimes it's just not. So I love the idea that we're getting more of these tools from reputable vendors, right? So it's not just a tool that's from, just from me, right? I could make a neat tool, but I'm just one person, and I probably wouldn't be very good at long-term support. So enrolled in the Docker Mastery course, awesome deep dive course, learning a lot from it, and it's cool stuff. Thanks. Thanks a lot, Pratik. That's great feedback. I am glad you are enjoying it. By the way, thumbs up to anyone who's taken my courses. Thumbs up in the channel. In this video, give me some thumbs up. Still working on the next sections for the Kubernetes course, and then you're going to be expecting an update to Docker Mastery about all the new Windows 10 stuff around WSL2. So that's going to be fun. Auto scaling, I do not, because this is my first day with this tool as well. I do not know how auto scaling will work. Maybe it's just an option. But basically, this is only going to do what ECS can do. Can I utilize EFS with ECS Fargate? Not yet, but that's already a discussion inside this. So if you're interested in this ECS beta, go over to the beta here. And if you have issues with the beta, definitely plug those in here. But if you have, I'm a little confused because you can either add new feature request here, which I would think would actually go into the Docker roadmap. So you might put ideas like supporting EFS inside this. You might put that over here, but there might already be an issue here. Yeah, support EFS volumes. So if you want that, then what you'll want to do is you go into the issue. And of course, I got to log in. Two-factor. Gotta get my two-factor code. All right, so per the rules of GitHub, if you want to support this issue, go over to the ECS plugin page, and we're going to add a thumbs up or a smiley face, but really the thumbs up I think is like the gold standard for I would like this feature. So that's how you get to communicate back to Docker that these features matter to you in this beta. So yeah, let's. You say volumes is not supported. Is there a plan to implement in the near future? So that's another check out the issues and the repo. I'm not sure. So yes, volumes are in the future. We just kind of established that, but I don't know what volume features are going to be first or when they're going to happen. But yes. Basically, since OpenSSH isn't really set up for Windows 10 normally, I use Git Bash, but I was wondering if there's a step-by-step video for someone else with the agent. So no, I think in my entire life, I've only set up OpenSSH daemon. I guess that's what you're talking about on Windows 10. I've only done it once back when they released it. I don't know what that was, 5 years ago or more. So no, I don't know, and I don't normally do that. I don't normally Windows SSH into a Windows server. So you think GitOps tools like Flux and Argo CD will work smoothly with this ECS plugin? No, because those tools are largely designed, well, they're exclusively designed for Kubernetes, and this has nothing to do with Kubernetes. So as far as I know, Flux and Argo are Kubernetes specific. Let's see. Can you explain the difference then with Docker AWS beta versus ECS command? Well, the difference obviously is that the ECS is going to have way more features because it's been around, right? I mean, this Docker beta is a very narrow feature set, but the goal here is that someone doesn't have to know the ECS command line or CloudFormation, or AWS CLI. They simply can use the Docker tool if they're coming from a Docker background and they know the Docker command line and they know Docker Compose, because as a developer gets more into their operations work, right? So if you imagine a typical workflow as a developer, they learn about containers, which means they don't have any experience with any container orchestrator, and they're learning Docker first. So they decide, oh, I'm going to learn Docker because I heard that this container thing is cool, and I want to do the Docker way. So they learn Docker, then they learn about Compose, and then they're like, and this is the same thing that happens in my courses. People say, hey, I want to get it on a server in the cloud. How do I do that? Well, that step ends up being really hard because now they have to go learn a cloud and the cloud's tooling, and then what does a server in the cloud look like? And then they're listening to me on one of my old courses, and they see me talk about Docker Machine, and they think they need to spin up an EC2 instance and care about the OS and the OS version, and then how to install Docker on the OS. Like there's just problem after problem after problem. And Docker's attitude now is that we want to make that easier for the developer. But 6 years ago, when they were creating things like Docker Machine, and then for a little while they had some other tooling, like we had a Docker automation tool that was about building clusters with Docker Enterprise, but none of those tools are really the future of Docker. They're either dying or going away or deprecated at this point. So the way now that Docker's attitude is no, we want to use the tooling of the container in the cloud. So with AWS, it's not install Docker on a single server, it's using ECS and eventually maybe EKS. But for now, they're focused on ECS because ECS is already compatible with Compose files. So this is the easiest way for them to get this going on AWS, right? Is to just stick with that. The idea here is one tool, not two. But obviously, with most tooling like this, you're going to have functionality loss at the cost of ease of use, right? Not every feature will probably be released with the 1.0 of this integration. All right. Can I skip the Docker Swarm and jump to Kubernetes in your course? Sure. If you don't want to learn a Swarm, however, do realize if you're in Docker Mastery, on my Docker Mastery course, it does expect you more or less to go through it in order. So the Kubernetes stuff builds on top of the concepts of Swarm. If you want a Kubernetes only experience that doesn't have any dependencies except for just understanding what Docker is, the Docker basics, then I recommend you go take Kubernetes Mastery. Kubernetes Mastery comes from the attitude of you don't care about Swarm, you simply want to use Kubernetes as your orchestrator. Whereas in Docker Mastery, it's about using Docker, then Compose, then Swarm, then learning Kubernetes, then learning registry, and like, down that list, right? Is there something similar for GCP? So no, the closest thing, we don't have any built-in Docker tooling yet for Google. The closest thing you could probably get to this on Google is to look up Google Cloud Run. It's still a separate tool, but it's the closest thing to like easy running one container in the cloud sort of setup. Google Cloud Run. But maybe we'll see that. Maybe Docker will build a Google Cloud Run add-on for the Docker command line. If you want that, and I'm going to sound repetitive, just go back over to the roadmap. Go back over to the roadmap, and let's just Google Cloud Run. Yeah, nope. There's nothing on Google Cloud Run. So maybe add that as a card. Anyone can add an issue that will show up as an idea. So if you want to see this on Google Cloud Run, throw it in there as an idea on the roadmap, and then the rest of us will thumbs up it. I am 50% on the Docker Mastery course, and I have already been able to take on some DevOps roles in our companies. Thank you. Great. Good job. And that tells me that my courses don't completely suck. So I'm glad I get so much feedback from people that have jumped into DevOps roles or gotten promotions or gotten new jobs because of stuff they've done in my courses. And that's the best feeling ever, is when you feel like you've helped somebody improve their career or to do something that they want to do, like have more fun in DevOps. Hello from Brazil. Biker says he's loving the Kubernetes Mastery class. The Marantis training class, and mine is much better. All right. Well, thank you. It is a much cheaper price to get my course on sale. So yeah. But there's more coming, right? So the nice thing is you have all my videos. You can always rewatch them, and there's a lot more coming. I know there's definitely some major sections I want to get in there on Helm, and storage is next. And then I want to talk about clusters and how to build them in the cloud. And there's so much stuff I want to put in there. So it's going to happen. Yeah, Charlie, the URLs are disabled by default, but the OpenSSH is built in now. Okay, cool. Yeah, I wouldn't imagine it would default out of the box, but that's awesome. Yeah, so I use Terraform, Archimedes. I use Terraform a lot, and I've often thought about releasing Terraform stuff, but in order to create a single server with Docker or something on it, is pretty easy in Terraform, and I feel like there's really no wrong way to do it, like when you're doing something that simple. So I've kind of avoided just deploying, sending people, 30-line Terraform files. But I think it's a worthwhile tool for all of us to learn at least the basics of Terraform. But in this case, again, Docker's trying to say, hey, you don't have to learn yet another tool. Just use the developer tooling that you have already. I'm not sure what this question is. By the way, excellent Final Fantasy logo. I'm not sure which Final Fantasy that is, but very nice. I have a bunch of services, for example, Project ABC, which require services such as Postgres and Redis. So if we would like to run ABC in the same time. So I'm guessing you're talking about startup order? I'm not sure what you're talking about. How do we avoid manually editing Docker Compose, such as same service or port for now? I manually disabled one by one and leave it online, one that I would like to use. I'm not sure what that question is. You, in other words, you want to shut stuff down in Docker Compose, so you can do a Docker Compose up and then specify the name of the service to control just an individual service. You can't actually do that with Docker Compose down. You can't down a individual service, but you can stop an individual service, so that way you don't have to comment things in and out. But I'm not sure exactly if that's the question you're asking. All right. Let's do some command line. Let's see. Let's see if I can't break this thing. All right. So I'm in the example voting app, and you'll notice I've now got context aware command lines. So I'm using Vim's. I'm sorry, this is not Vim. This is OhmyZSH. This is all available over on my new shell page. This is from last week's. If you were here on last week's show, I talked all about my shell. I did some demos, and then I went and spent hours and hours updating this page with a more organized, bringing things into sections about colors, about editors, about fonts, and sort of updating things in bad links. And I've already gotten some more updates from people on Twitter that I need to apply here. So people are helping me keep this in sync. I probably should turn this into some sort of GitHub repo that just pulls from GitHub instead of a blog post because it's ever changing. But anyway, that is my shell. And in here, I am using some new features in the Docker shell. So if you're on the latest Docker beta and you do Docker context show, it's a new command that will tell you, it'll spit back at you the context here you're using, right? So if I have a Docker context ls, that shows me my list. And you'll see here, I even have the one from last week, this ACI. Oh, actually, that was 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago, we did an ACI show on the ACI beta extension, and I changed the context to that. And so that one's there. And then this is my default. Where'd that one go? Oh, this one right here. This is my default one. It's basically always on your system. If you're running Docker Desktop, it will always create a default one. And then I've created some that are a remote cluster. And then I have also another remote cluster down here. So what we're going to have to do is create another context for this ECS cluster. And my little profile up here, my little context in my command line will change. All right. So if we just look at their little image example instead of reading the documentation. All right, so let's do a Docker ECS setup, it says. Let's see, I'm going to call it AWS. Use the arrows to select. I'm going to use my existing one. We're going to call it ECS 01. We'll put it in the east. And I shouldn't need credentials. No idea if that's going to be a good thing. And then Docker context ls. It should use my AWS keys from my existing AWS CLI. All right, so now I can do Docker context. It's use. I always get the use command and the config on kube control. They're quite different. All right, so we're going to do AWS. So now you'll notice that my command line is using that AWS context there next to the Docker logo. So no, so Docker version, the Docker version that I'm using is the latest edge. So This is the latest edge. Interestingly enough, the Docker version is spitting out the server, but I'm pretty sure that server is not ECS. So that some of these commands we'll learn, like certain commands only work with certain plugins. In the case of this one, well, I'll explain that in a minute. I'll tell you how that works in a minute. So that's the version. It's just the latest edge, basically the latest beta. When you create a new context, does that create a new VM on your host? No, a context is simply a metadata configuration on your machine to point to some other setup of Docker. So now that Docker has, so in other words, the first way we use context is I spin up Docker on a different Linux machine and then, or on a Windows machine, and then I will create a new context to point to that machine from my Docker local CLI. We always want to do that versus having to SSH in the servers and then run Docker locally. It's just way easier to have all of my stuff locally, including my compose files, my Docker file builds. And when I'm doing all that stuff, it's working against the remote server. So that's what a context does. This works exactly, by the way, this works exactly the same way as the kube control context for Kubernetes. All right. And then the other thing is that the context now is what we use to point to a cloud. So with the ACI and now the ECS plugins, you're creating a new context to point to a cloud rather than to a Docker endpoint. So if I do that Docker context ls again, you'll see that the type, it's a little hard to read there. If I zoom out, you'll see the type. So that type column here on the left is kind of small, but the Moby type means a Docker engine. And then we now have these two new types, ACI and AWS. So those are the new plugins. Now, in the case of this one for AWS, AWS's plugin is added as a Docker CLI plugin. This is a little bit different than the the ACI plugin. So when we did, if you remember from 2 weeks ago, not to get any of these things confused, when we did the Azure ACI commands, we could use something like Docker compose up, and that would work. But in this case, everything we're going to do is with the Docker ECS command first. And that reason, this is only for the beta. Okay, so Docker, I believe, is communicating this where they can add in stuff to the command line really easy through a plugin model, because Docker command line has a bunch of stuff called the plugin, command line plugin. You can actually see those under, let's see. Oh, wait, it's under Docker CLI plugins. So you can see that I have some plugins there on my machine, and those plugins are the ones that I added to the machine. Docker comes with its own that are behind the scenes, and those plugins allow Docker to add more functionality without changing the CLI binary. So this allows them during beta periods to iterate a little faster because it's technically a separate command. It's actually a separate binary. So anyway, the point I'm saying is that yes, this is inconsistent, but I'm told that this is going to change once it's released, and it's permanently added to the Docker binary. Right now, this is technically a separate file, and Docker's just calling out to that Go binary at runtime. All right, so we have the Docker ECS command now, and I've changed my context, so I'm pointing to the cloud, and I'll see that I have setup, which we already did. I can do ECS version, and that's showing me the version of that plugin that we talked about. And then the only other command that's really of interest here besides secrets, which I'm not going to get into secrets today, but is the compose command. And then that compose command has a couple of basic options: the up, the down, the logs, the PS, and then a convert. And the convert is all about changing a compose file over to CloudFormation in case you want to manually edit the CloudFormation after the fact. If you've ever used other tools, there are other tools for compose to convert it into CloudFormation, and this is doing it now all built into Docker, so we don't have to go find one of those conversion tools. All right, so presumably a Docker ECS compose up will work if I have a compatible compose file. but we know there are some limitations in the existing beta. For example, we can't use volumes. So I am currently, I'm here, not here. Let's do here. I am currently in the example voting app directory. So I love this demo. It's a simple demo that has two websites. One is where you vote, one is where you see the results. It has a database backend, and then it has a cache Redis solution with a worker process. So it's kind of a typical web workflow, right? You've got a sort of a client front end and a admin back end, and it's just complicated enough to show examples of how you would deploy, maybe using different networks for security, using a front end and back end approach, different types of applications, including persistent data, like your Postgres database. So in this case, though, we know we can't use volumes. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to copy, actually. I'm just going to copy out the stack simple, because I know that one's one of the simplest ones, we're going to call it the AWS YAML. Oops. The copy is the Windows command. What did the Linux command? All right. So now I can open up AWS YAML. And we're going to probably have to delete some things. I'm going to delete all of the deploy stuff. And then we know we can't do volumes. So for now, I'm just going to comment it out. And I'm going to take out the network stuff because I'm just assuming this doesn't work, but we can look later to see if the networking stuff works. But that's mostly meant for Docker networks. And let's see. That port is probably going to have to change. So I'm going to delete the depends on stuff. And then let's see, 5001. Deleting the placement constraints. And then I'm going to delete out these volumes of network. So this is a pretty simple setup. Basically, we have ports. We have databases. I'm not sure if I need to specify the port. Let's just see what happens here. Just comment out the ports. See if it works. I have no idea. Okay, so they map network abstractions to AWS security groups. The whole application is created with a single VPC. Security groups are created per networks, including the implicit default one. Ooh. Okay, so we could use the networks. Well, let's go back in there. Tell you what, we're going to just comment things out. We're not going to delete. So I'm going to comment out the deploy stuff. We're going to leave the networking stuff in because it's a great example of a network least privilege where your front end apps don't have access. Basically your back end apps don't have access from the internet. So the only thing that's available outside to the public would be the web interfaces. So let's see if that works. Leaving the networks in. Then, okay, so now we have ports. I think I need to change this to 5001. Although, now that I think about it, the voting app may run on port 80. Yeah, we'll have to check that. Yeah, these apps probably run on port 80. So the problem here is if I do 8080, then on this one, It also needs to run on 80, but I can't do translation. We're going to have to change the app. And I don't know. So I want to check real quick to see if that port, the result app, has .net. Let's do this. Let's search for port. Ooh, okay. So yeah, it will accept. Okay. Yep. It looks like we'll accept the import environment variable. Super. So let's back up. Open up that AWS file again. So the app developer, like a good app developer, allows the port to be changed by environment variables in the result app. So what we're going to do is we're going to change port equals 5001, and hopefully that will run it on the correct port. All right, let's try it. Docker ECS compose up. Ooh, does not exist. Oh, did I skip a step? Okay, so we're on the right context. Watching the little demo here. Okay, so did not work as expected, even though we've changed the AWS context. Let's do setup again. Let's call it AWS 2. We're going to use my existing profile. We're going to call it ECS 02, ECS 2. Region, no. And then Docker context, use AWS 2 context. All right, so now you see on my command line, my context has changed to AWS 2. And then I should just be able to hit the up arrow, and let's see. ECS 2 does not exist. All right, so clearly it's not as simple as that. All right. Do you ever find, let's see, let's ask some questions real quick. You ever found an issue about high CPU usage when running Docker Compose for multiple services on Mac? How we fixed it, or was normally use case when we were running multiple services? I have not seen that specifically, at least I don't recall. No, because Docker Compose is really just using Docker in the background. So I'm not sure if it's what your issue is with that. GPUs and containers. So yes, various tools have support for GPUs. The answer is yes. Yes, you can. Biker says DigitalOcean credit with use your K8 service, but found the nodes are very hard to use, like they were emulated. Switch to a real droplet VM and it works great. Okay. I have not had any issues, but I've only used it for personal projects. For example, the beta version of my website is running on a DigitalOcean cluster, and it works fine. It has for a couple of months now, but that's all I've really used it for in terms of real things. I don't have like clients running on it, so I don't have that kind of experience. Does Customize support Docker Compose? No. Oh, yes, you're right. You're right. It's using the wrong. Well, I don't know. Is it though? Can it use? Might be right, Moz. Let me see. It was a weird error for that though. Undefined network front end. All right, so it's a different error. All right, so I have recommendations on errors. Oh, right. I want to comment out the networks if we're going to use them. All right, let's try it. Ah, we didn't comment out the volumes. Oh, we did. No, we didn't. All right, so Maz's suggestion was I wasn't specifying. Yeah, it still says ECS2 does not exist. So it's maybe due to my authentication. So I did give a cluster name. All right, so they did leave it blank. Let's see about that. All right, we're using the third context. Third time's a charm. Look at that. Good job. Shalish. Hopefully I didn't say that incorrectly. You win the tip of the day. You and Maz keeping me in line. All right. So if you try to name the cluster, I guess it means that it's one that already exists. I don't. Doesn't seem very intuitive, but doesn't say anything about it in the docs. So of course, being AWS, this means we've got to wait a while. So let's talk about some more questions. Give me some questions. Thanks. I'll bill you later. Yeah. Send me the bill. That was a weird random tip. Don't enter a value. How did you figure that out? I mean, I'm watching this thing and if there's a chance to name something, I'm always going to name it. Like, why wouldn't you name it? By the way, over on Twitch, we still got the AWS live thing going on there. People are chatting away for the cloud conference, in case you want to watch some of those videos instead of me. Because all I'm doing is waiting on the internet. Also, has anyone taken the EKS workshop website? I'm going to go through that here pretty soon. I have not taken it, so. All right. Did I see you use Docker Compose earlier, not Docker ECS Compose, nor, of course, Docker Compose? Can you explain that briefly for anyone who may have missed it? Okay, so Docker Compose, as we know it, is now not just one thing. So Docker Compose is a command line that we all know for running development. It is a separate command line from Docker, okay? And it's actually written in Python versus Docker, which is written in Go. So it's a separate binary. You install it a different way. If you're on a Linux machine, the best way to install it is pip. It doesn't have an apt package and never will, evidently. And so Docker for years, in fact, I can go back all the way to 2016, maybe 2017 at a conference in Berlin that Docker had a bunch of people at that I was a part of. That at that conference, they talked about the desire to move the compose functionality into the Docker command line, making it one large tool, because compose and Docker were like two parts of the same coin, and making it easier for us to all run containers or multiple containers with the Docker command line was always their goal. And so they've tried that several ways since then. We've actually had some hacks where we created a Docker plugin, a CLI plugin that used compose in the background. But then when Docker had DockerCon this year, they released a new beta that had the Docker Compose as a command. That's funny. Did my ACI? All right. So something's now changed with the beta. I may have a beta that doesn't have this. I'm not sure. So at DockerCon, Docker Compose became a command inside the Docker binary. So you would not put a dash in it. So this is a subcommand versus the separate Python binary. And this only works currently with the Azure ACI deployment. Now, of course, on my machine, as of today, it doesn't work at all. So, the live AWS EKS one. Let me give you that in chat. Yeah. So that's the second way. Now with ECS is another beta, and the way they're building this beta is they're building it as a command line plugin. One of the limitations of that is that when you create a command line plugin for Docker, everything has to be under your command line's sub command. So it has to always be Docker ECS and then the command. So there are other plugins. In fact, if you just do a Docker and you hit enter from your command line, if you scroll up, any of these with an asterisk, these are all separate binaries that are known as command line plugins. I have app, I have build kit, which is technically a separate command line tool, clip, which is a third-party add-on for adding more extensions. The new ECS tool right here, and then I have my own custom one that I made called Vacup, which I've talked about on this show before. But anyway, so all of these are plugins, and they're technically just separate binaries that the Docker command line calls separately. Okay, so with this new ECS plugin, Docker since they're doing it as a plugin, they have to do ECS. Now, what the eventual plan is that once this released out of beta, and this is a full 1.0, is that it will be rolled into the Docker binary directly, and we will hopefully be able to do Docker Compose up. The dream here is that whatever your current context is, right? So right now I have AWS 3 as my context. The ultimate goal is that I change context, and then when I do a Docker PS or a Docker Compose PS, that all these tools are working against, whether it's the cloud or it's a remote Docker server or it's my local Docker server, that it's context aware and it will give me the proper response. We are far from that goal. This is something that's just happened in the last few months. I would say that the context itself, just the Docker context, is a relatively new command. It came out a few years ago, and it hasn't been used for much. The only type of context that it worked with was the Moby context, which is just a Docker endpoint somewhere either on your local machine or a remote server. It's only in the last few months that we started to get these third-party types that are talking to cloud APIs for that context. So thanks, Charlie. That's a great question, and hopefully that answered it for those that are catching up. All right, have I finished? No. So, I don't know if it's ever going to finish. Seems like it's really taking a long time. This little demo right here, if accurate, was edited down from 10 minutes to 30 seconds. All right. So because I wonder if I can do over here, because I'm running the same context, I wonder if I can do a Docker ECS PS. Oops, ECS compose PS. Oh, okay. Right. So I have to be in the directory. So Docker example. So every command has to use that AWS file. Okay. So it's definitely not finished. And let's see. So it's not showing me a result because one of the apps is still not running. So it's not giving me the stats of the other one. I feel like the Jeopardy music should be played right now. Does the ECS plugin run CloudFormation templates in the background? Yes. So we learned from the repo that the way this is working is a compose YAML is parsed, converted into a CloudFormation template, which then creates all resources in dependent order and cleans up on down command or deployment failure. The load phase relies on compose go. Any generic code we write for this purpose should be proposed upstream. So compose go, I don't actually know about this. Oh, this is part of the compose spec. Oh, very cool. All right, so on this show months ago, we talked about the open sourcing of the compose spec. So the compose file as we know it is one part, as well as the Docker compose command line, are parts of this larger idea about what compose is as a tool and as a standard. And it's never had a standard or spec behind it. So Docker announced earlier this year that they were going to create a spec, as well as working with other vendors like AWS to create a standard around all the tooling that already exists for compose. If you start looking out there, there's well over a 500,000 compose files on GitHub. I think it's up to like 700,000 compose files. There are many different tools for just about everything out there, including ECS, Kubernetes, and other tooling that use compose as the standard way to describe your app and its dependencies. And so Docker was saying, we're going to do that. So they created a whole website around it. And they evidently now have this Go binary, which I have not been here before, but this might be an implementation of their compose spec in the Go language, which they're using, it sounds like, inside of this ECS plugin. Then there's a validation that, of course, you have to validate the compose spec against what we know today. Now, what we know today, the closest thing is the version 3 of the compose file. If you go look at the compose spec, it's a little, I haven't actually seen a true spec that makes sense to me. So you have to go look at implementations of that spec. And you can see here like compose with a K, which is for Kubernetes, the Docker compose command line, which is what we use right now. That's what we're using today is the compose command line YAML. And then compose on Kubernetes, which is another tool that Docker makes that runs inside a Kubernetes cluster and takes compose and dynamically turns it into manifest. That tool has its own compatibility with the Compose spec. So yeah, you have all that stuff there. So then it does a conversion in the background, and then it applies that to the AWS CLI. So we could still do all this with other tools like the ECS CLI and the AWS CLI. But the goal here is that Docker is trying to implement the minimum features of those all into the Docker tool itself in sort of a AWS official way with the AWS team support. All right, so I'm going to assume this is stuck. And I don't know why. I have plenty of resources in my VPC, so I'm not sure why it would be limiting me. All right, let's go back to, since we're waiting on that still, let's go back to some questions. I read some information about Docker Swarm and will be dead in end of development and support approximately next 18 months. What do you think about it? That would be outdated information. The last thing we heard from, if you just go to this show, you go to brett.live. If you go to my past videos on my channel, you can see we have a Docker Swarm 2020 update. So I'm going to put this in chat so that you can see that. So go check that out. And basically, Mirantis has pledged to grow the Swarm team, and they've already committed to multiple new features this year. Now, I don't think we've heard anything else from Mirantis since then, but that was in February, and they were supposed to announce stuff around KubeCon, but I haven't seen anything from them since KubeCon got delayed to August. So my guess is we are going to hear, hopefully, something from them in August around new features for Swarm. Swarm has actually already had new features here in 2020. They just haven't been added to Docker since Docker hasn't had a major release yet in 2020. So we're waiting on the Docker engine to be updated with those new Swarm features. That specifically, we're looking at a new feature for jobs, Swarm jobs. So yeah, I love Swarm too. It does a great job at, and the community hopefully will keep it alive. Mirantis is sort of committed to working on it. So I think for now we're all hoping that they'll keep with the resources. Loving the Docker Master Course. Another fan. Great. Thanks, Kyle. All right. Looks like what's happening. Stack creation time exceeded for the specified timeout. So I'm going to have to go look at my dashboard. All right. We are deletion in progress. All right, so I tried to deploy a very simple setup. It just timed out and then deleted them. And so what it's doing now is, like any good CloudFormation, because one thing failed, it's deleting everything. And over here, if it's too fast, I think we were in East 2. Was it East 1? Yeah. Example voting app. So it looks like it used the name of my Compose app. That's pretty cool. So it's deleting that cluster now. Yep. So yeah. Oh, that was EKS. Wrong button. So yeah, it looked like it created it, um, but for some reason it failed. I wonder if it's going to delete the whole cluster or if it's just going to remove all the tasks. So these things are all changing from created complete to delete complete. And I am not sure why I deleted them all. You are most welcome. Nice little logo there. The DevOps. All right. Well, unfortunately, I've been live for 90 minutes. So I'm not gonna try to redeploy and wait another 10 minutes. Um, I will go back and hopefully have a better demo for next time. But what's interesting though is it shows Fargate here. One Fargate. So I wonder if it's using it in Fargate mode. I didn't actually read that in the documentation. It might be doing that. And I guess it's going to sit there and wait. All right. Well, that's boring. All right. So I will see about this and also the ACI. So the ACI one from Azure is also getting updates. So you can jump back on this channel every week. Sometimes I have guests. Sometimes we're recording a demo of a third-party tool with a vendor. And sometimes it's me just fooling around like this. And then sometimes I'm just taking your questions and I have no agenda or nothing else to talk about. So you're just going to have to show up on Thursdays. Remember to like and subscribe and click that little bell down here at the bottom so that you get notification whenever I go live. You can also support this show and the podcast and the newsletter and all my free YouTube content by going to my Patreon page, which is also down below. And of course, my course coupons are down there. You can get all that stuff over here. And if you don't remember my YouTube channel, I now have a permanent URL for that, brett.live, to just jump over to all my videos. And I want to thank you all for jumping in and hanging out with me for the last 90 minutes. Hopefully my demos in the future will work better. But as these betas keep dropping on Thursdays, hours before I go live, I don't really get a chance to dive into them before we go live. So this is kind of me futzing around with it. If you get it to work, by the way, feel free. If you figured out what's wrong or you figured out how to make your own stuff work with these, put stuff in the comments. Tell me how you did it. Link to the GitHub repo that you're doing this stuff in, and I'll go check it out. And for that, I will say ciao, and I'll see you next week here on YouTube Live.